the lessons for the polity as a whole. Grasping and producing accounts of blackness as such can yield benefits for all Americans and for being American as such. What Nahum Chandler calls a non-reducibility of the structure of consciousness. In Originary Displacement, an essay that he wrote, he states, quote, Ralph Ellison's suggestion, proposed in his 1964 critical review of Leroy Jones' Amiri Baraka's Blues People, quote, it is possible that any viable theory of Negro American culture obligates us to fashion a more adequate theory of American culture as a whole, end quote. We should generalize and therefore radicalize W.E.B. Du Bois's formulation of the African American sense of identity as, quote, a kind of double consciousness, experienced under the palpable force of the practice of racial distinction, to American identities as such, and to modern subjectivities in general. I apologize, I exported a keynote file to PowerPoint to get, because the other one wasn't moving, so they're a little bit blurry. But I started to work on some diagrams to theorize about the way in which identity is formed using, on the one hand, culture, ethnicity, and race, nation, and geography. On the other hand, some of the ways that we ascribe identity to people, which is through behavior, lifestyle, and class, and trying to understand how the role of aesthetics as a cognitive trigger or as a cueing device promotes one or the other or some combination thereof of the transmission of identity through visible and invisible means, conscious and unconscious means. Modernist architectural movements in the Americas is emblematized by two things, really. One, post-war development of the American suburb, largely white. And two, the onslaught of urban renewal and public housing projects and urban infrastructure built in the 1950s and 60s. This is what constitutes, for the United States, the modernist interventions in life as we know it. The American suburb and its expansive impact on racial segregation is well documented, as are the positivist intentions of new urbanism, a contemporary movement, relatively young movement, to increase the density of new suburban-style developments and a replacement strategy for the public housing built in the 1950s and 60s. However, what has not been sufficiently theorized or critiqued is the relationship between suburban new urbanist ideology and the European biased interpretation of the American demographic and physical landscape. These theoretical frames are linked and have become canonical fixtures in the discipline. Colin Rowe, canonical architectural theorist of architecture and urbanism, states, quote, integration and segregation related to both politics and perception can scarcely lead us elsewhere than to the predicament of the American black community. There was and is the ideal of integration, and there was and is the ideal of segregation. But if both ideals may be supported by a variety of arguments, proper and improper, there remains the evidence that when gross injustice begins to be removed, the barriers which were formerly maintainable from the outside are just as reconstructible from within, end quote. There is no bigger proponent of questioning the appropriateness of European modernism's intervention in the United States than Colin Rowe. Rowe believed that America's distance from Europe breeded a disillusion of modernism's edge, if it had one to begin with, in that it was this distance from the political social struggles of 1968, 1945, and pre-World War II periods, whereby the architectural solution that modernism had to the social problems was a direct result of these historical events having to do purely with the identity of Europe. He states while with regard to Europe, it is possible to argue that modern architecture was conceived as an adjunct of socialism and probably sprang from approximately the same ideological roots as Marxism. In America, an indigenous modern architecture was very conspicuously unequipped with any such implicit social program or politically critical pedigree, end quote. He further states that when an American, a quote, American architecture emerges, as in Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian houses or Broadacre City, it offers no intrinsic challenge to the social order. No radical social reconstruction is proposed as a result or consequence. He states that when in the 1930s modernism came to infiltrate the United States, it was seen more as a mere efficient way, a more efficient way to build than a new concept of social relations. Quote, it was introduced largely purged of its ideological or societal content, and it became available not as an evident manifestation or cause of socialism in some form or other, but rather as a decor de la vie for Greenwich, Connecticut, or as a suitable veneer for the corporate activities of, quote, enlightened capitalism, end quote. Manfredo Tufuri, another architectural theorist, in his canonical book, Architecture and Utopia, states, the settlement was thus to be an oasis of order, an example of how it is possible for working class organizations to propose an alternative model of urban development, a realized utopia. But the settlement itself openly set the model of the town against that of the large city. Tufuri's insightful critique of Frank Lloyd Wright's anti-urban rural romanticism, Carl Stein and Ebenezer Howard's vision of bringing the wilderness into the city, represent the inauguration of a suburban psychology embedded within the notions of the nation. These ideas have their roots in European democratic socialism and emerge today as new urbanism. This misreading of the American city resulted in the elision of the material cultural processes that disproportionately impacted the way in which black subjects cohere their physical and psychic environment. Formation of black subjectivity as full citizens is urban. Production of whiteness is affiliated with suburbanism. Thus, modernism set in place a territorial reading of the city that exacerbated the racial divisions that were latent and invisible in the legal infrastructures of the nation. Now, Detroit, as an example, is a city that continues to be 87% black and is a very critical moment that we should all take note of. Detroit is home to one of the country's iconic industries, the automobile industry, as well as Motown, electronic music. The city is governed by an elected mayor, but was for the past several years run by an emergency manager appointed by the governor with extraordinary power and autonomy. The city, now emerging from the largest municipal bankruptcy in the nation, finds itself at a crossroads. A billionaire entrepreneur has purchased over 100 buildings in downtown and midtown districts, acquired another 100 acres from other sources, including the city, and has won several requests for proposals for targeted new development. Another billionaire has accepted $450 million in series bonds, public subsidy, to construct a new hockey rink. Philanthropic institutions came out of pocket for $800 million in the so-called grand bargain simply to save the Detroit Institute of the Arts from a sell-off as a public asset of value, and to save retired and current pensioners from seeing drastic cuts in their pensions. In addition, nonprofits have expended over $300 million in addition to the grand bargain to fund everything from early childhood education to a light rail system. New restaurants are opening up at a clip of 50 per year, and hipsters eager to take advantage of cheap rents and living space have flocked to the city. The only problem is that most of the activity that I just described is happening in a 7 square mile area of a city that is 148 square miles, the size of San Francisco, Boston, and Manhattan combined. The problem of Detroit is the problem in so many cities that are or have been majority black. Inevitable gentrification, with segregated neighborhoods seeing no significant transformation in their spatial environment. And again, trying to use the toolkit of architecture and critical thinking to diagram what's happening in the conception, our perceptions of the city, but also the perceptions of things like the kind of rotated images collected and aggregated of police shootings and things of that sort. So looking at how the visual field is operating in terms of vehiculating a kind of documentary event moving towards politicized representation, depiction, and then a kind of settled notion of what the ethics are, what the political story is, what the meta-narrative is after having gone through those transformations. These are diagrams by W.E.B. Du Bois looking at city and rural population in 1890, assessed valuation of taxable property owned by Negroes in Georgia. So trying to bring very much the an analysis, visual analysis and diagram analysis of what is happening in cities. Now I want to turn to the problem case of architecture theory. Why is the American inner city the focus of so much recent attention in the face of Black Lives Matter and the revisionist histories of the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the scale and impacts of mass incarceration in the United States? How are the U.S.-based problems, such as policing, housing, and educational challenges, related to a lack of urban vision or failed versions of the idealized modernist city? Theories have come to suffice for a unifying logic of blackness as a stand-in for racial otherness. Theories that have come to suffice for a unifying logic of blackness as a stand-in for racial otherness merely translate the modernist ideal for unity of consciousness into a trope of racial and political inclusion. My interest is in pinning down the spatial and visual context in which these discursive tensions can be understood to constitute an architecture-race theory that neither reduces blackness to a political ambition, nor does it affirm every product of black culture as virtuous. Modern architecture, modernity, and idealized democratic values such as egalitarianism, social freedom, and equality were bonded together in part by myth, ideology, and epistemology. In the United States, the twin circumstances of post-colonial city building and the importing of European modernism produced paradoxes at the outset that have proven very resistant to change. Industrialized cities, home to diverse populations, racial and class discord, would yield to the invention of the suburb and the complexities of the urban-rural divide. Urbanization evolved not according to natural evolution or even market-based capitalism, but according to an aberrant logic of racialization and territorialization brought about by constrained choices, abject violence, and institutionalized enforcement of class inequality. Contrary to recent discussions of post-raciality, architecture and urbanism need to reinvest in a contemporary accounting of where we are. Far from retreating from a racialized lens, architecture and urbanism need what I am inaugurating as an architecture race theory, conceptualized around what black spatial subjectivity, what black subjectivity can contribute to a global conversation on humanism, as well as revisionist methodologies for reconciling the lack of black agency in the production of contemporary architecture and architecture theory. Like legal scholars Derek Bell and Alan Freeman before me, I too am frustrated at the pace of change, the slow pace of change, in adjusting our methodologies and epistemic foundations in architecture theory to reform our academic and professional institutions. Architectural theory emerges as an identifiable and distinct entity in the late 1960s and early 1970s. When architectural theory becomes separated from what we call architectural criticism, taking a building as the object of criticism and doing criticism that you might see in the newspaper, and architectural history. Architectural history, looking at historical methods, looking at historical buildings, and writing and commenting about that. Architectural theory becomes distinct from these two subdisciplinary categories in the late 60s, early 70s. K. Michael Hayes, in Architecture Theory since 1968, and Architecture's Desire, reading the late avant-garde, asserts that architecture is central to the domains of cultural representation and is a signifying force in the processes of symbolic production. For those literary folks in the audience, that may sound like Frederick Jameson in The Political Unconscious, in describing literature as a symbolic act. Through case studies that link architecture theory and other disciplines, such as philosophy and literature, he asserts that an essential ingredient of the architectural avant-garde is a more intimate relation to the ideas that power contemporary cultural production. Hayes's intellectual blindness towards the multivalent impact of race on the cultural imagination articulates itself in his treatment of the cultural body and polity as a whole, as a single universal. In the mid-1990s, new paradigms emerged in examining race and culture from the perspectives of Black theorists and women working in fields as diverse as philosophy, American studies, English and comparative literature, women's and gender studies. Paradigm-shifting work such as Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, Kimberly Crenshaw's Critical Race Theory, the key writings that form the movement, and Thomas Sugrew's The Origin of the Urban Crises, gave formal articulation to theoretical correctives that run counter to prevailing characterizations of the Black diasporic subject, the universalizing and idealized logic of American jurisprudence, and the depiction of the nation's urban inner-city crises as self-inflicted by Black subjects. These canonical works set the stage for more recent works that mediate between humanities scholarship, visual culture, and race. Works such as Madhu Dubé's Signs in Cities, Black Literary Postmodern, Catherine Yorka's White Diaspora, The Suburb in the 20th Century Novel, and Alan Reed's The Fact of Blackness, Franz Fanon, and Visual Representation. These works successfully bring cultural theory and a deep interrogation of racial consciousness into the realm of the visual. Works such as Elizabeth Abel's Signs of the Times and Luis Castaneda's Spectacular Mexico, Design Propaganda in the 1968 Olympics, effectively place architecture and urban design in complicity with race-based visual apparatuses that reinforce, inscribe, or explicitly resist dominant political and social forces. In doing so, their scholarship reveals veiled structural and systemically embedded instances of racial animus and raciality. Work in architecture theory, squarely aimed at zeroing in on the race-architecture intersection, emerged in the early 1990s with Appendix Journal, which Jeanette mentioned that I co-edited, emerging in the early 1990s, to expose new scholarship on race, gender, and sexuality. Also collected volumes such as Craig Barton's Sites of Memory, Perspectives on Architecture and Race, Leslie Loco's White Papers, Black Marks, Architecture, Race, Culture. They expose new thinking on historic preservation and landscape in indigenous Black communities and other issues related to architecture and race. Authors such as Mabel Wilson in Negro Building, Black Americans in the World Fairs and Museums, and Darrell Field's Architecture in Black, and Mario Gooden's Dark Space, Architecture Representation, Black Identity. These theorists have leveraged work in visual culture and identity theory to formulate unique and internal perspectives on modern architecture's deep systems of logic that continue to embed negative racialized consciousness into the theorizing, teaching, and practice of architecture and urban design. The discipline of architecture has long relied as well upon architectural expositions, exhibitions, and now biennials to pronounce movements in the field and or consolidate movements already afoot and thus concretizing them and marking their place in history. In 1967, Architecture and Urban Renewal, Urban Museum of Modern Art by Arthur Drexler. There's the image of the cover of that exhibition, which was very interesting because the exhibition took parts of New York. This is an area of Harlem that was reimagined by one of the teams, Colin Rowe, a part of that team, working on how to rethink Manhattan, and specifically Harlem. And that show opened in 1967. In 1968, Harlem on My Mind, Cultural Capital of Black America, 1900 to 1968, curated at the Metropolitan Museum, by Alan Schoner, Visual Arts Director of the New York State Council of the Arts. In 2004, Velma Goldman curated Harlem World Metropolis as Metaphor at the Studio Museum in Harlem, a showcase of 18 black architects thinking about Harlem with a broad array of methods and visual strategies of representation. That's Emory Douglas, who was exhibited here last year, amazing artist and thinker coming from the Black Panther movement. And then this was my entry contribution into the Harlem World Metropolis as Metaphor exhibition, where I was very much looking at social housing on 112th Street and how to begin to think about the relationship between capital in the city and new forms of mixed use, new forms of grafting public investment in housing and mixed use into that community. So these were speculative visions of how to break, in a way, a cycle of site-specific work where you only have housing, or you only have retail, and to try to mix that and begin to think about how that begins to make the city, the legibility of the city, the legibility of the people living in the city, different than what existed before. So there were various operations to try to do that. Barry Bergdahl curated Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream at the Museum of Modern Art in 2012. Pedro Gadanho curated Uneven Growth, Tactical Urbanisms for Expanding Megacities, also at the Museum of Modern Art in 2014. In Foreclosed, in 2012, the flawed pretext of soliciting solutions for architecture's complicity with the housing bubble and foreclosure crisis of 2008 to 2010 produces architectural renderings of how to speculatively urbanize predominantly white suburbs through both architecture and the so-called Buell hypothesis, a text generated by at Columbia University, which attempts to change the script of the classic American dream. The intellectual blindnesses in these shows is mind-boggling in the sense that very few, no African-American architects, except for the Harlem World show, were involved in any of these shows. And the versions of rethinking the American dream come as an afterthought in terms of how that reconfiguration might affect black cities or black subjects. More recently, the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale, Reporting from the Front, curated by Alejandro Arabena, and the U.S. Pavilion, The Architectural Imagination, focused on Detroit, curated by Cynthia Davidson and Monica Ponce-de-Leon. Now, with that as a kind of context, the basis of rethinking architecture theory and looking at other movements, I think, is very key to what I'm trying to construct here. And I want to move through a couple of other movements and then wrap up. The basis of key movements of critical legal studies, critical race theory, and most recently critical race psychology follow similar scripts in indexing the race-integrated approach towards disciplinary interventions in law, legal theory, and psychology. What follow are some of the basic tenets of critical race theory and critical race psychology. First, critical race theory. What do critical race theorists believe? First, that racism is ordinary, not aberrational, normal science, the usual way society does business, the common, everyday experience of most people of color in the country. Second, most would agree that our system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material. First feature, ordinariness, means that racism is difficult to cure or address. colorblind or formal conceptions of equality expressed in rules that insist only on treatment that is the same across the board can thus remedy only the most blatant forms of discrimination, such as mortgage redlining or the refusal to hire black PhDs rather than a white high school dropout. The second feature, sometimes called interest convergence or material determinism, adds a further dimension, because racism advances the interests of both white elites materially and working class people psychically. Large segments of society have little incentive to eradicate. A third theme of critical race theory, the social construction thesis, holds that race and races are products of social thought and social relations. Closely related to differential racialization, the idea that each race has its own origins and ever-evolving history is the notion of intersectionality and anti-essentialism. No person has a single, easily stated, unitary identity. Another important element of the critical race theory movement was legal storytelling. The legal storytelling movement urges black and brown writers to recount their experiences with racism and the legal system and to apply their own unique perspectives to assess law's master narratives. Now, in critical race psychology, the following 5 tenets are in play. 1, an approach to racism as a systemic force embedded in everyday society. 2, illuminate how ideologies of neoliberal individualism often reflect and reproduce racial domination. 3rd, identify interest convergence as the typical source of broad-based support for reparative action. 4, emphasize possessive investment in privileged identities and identity-infused realities that reproduce racial domination. And 5, propose practices of counter-storytelling to reveal and contest identity-infused bases of everyday society. Now, in my conception of architecture race theory, we take into account the conception of social theory. I want to go to Hegel, Georg Hegel for that, in thinking about how a person, how an individual gets recognized as being valuable and having legitimacy in the society. And Hegel states that one of the central tasks of the institutions of ethical life is to fashion the subjectivities of social members so as to make them into the kind of agents who are capable of achieving self-determination. Such agents, he says, must meet 2 basic conditions. First, they must value and therefore be motivated to achieve their freedom as persons and as moral subjects. Second, they must possess the basic subjective capacities that are needed in order to realize their aspirations to be free in both of these senses. Freedom, according to Hegel, does not come naturally. Without prodding, individuals may not be equipped to realize freedom. Therefore, quote, since uniform subjects lack even the aspiration to be free, since uninformed subjects lack even the aspiration to be free, they lack both the knowledge of their true essence and the desire to achieve it. It is intrinsic to the nature of this notion of forming maturity, that it take place unconsciously and involuntarily, behind the backs, so to speak, of the very subjects who undergo the process of formation. Now, Hegel's social theory, derived primarily from his Philosophy of Right book and from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's concept of freedom, posits that freedom is the authoritative value of modernity. And he describes personal freedom, freedom of moral subjectivity, and then the ultimate or substantial freedom being social freedom. He defines social freedom as a distinctive species of freedom that can be realized only by and within institutions. Channeling Rousseau, he posits that there is an objective component and subjective component to substantial or social freedom. Social institutions must be befitting of freedom, and individuals must be in alignment with their social institutions to fully enjoy the benefits of the ultimate social freedom. This alignment involves a subjective disposition, whereby the frame of mind or consciousness of the individual is made whole by their investment in the social institution, in outlining qualitative determinacy in difference from others. Hegel concludes that the individual must have universal qualities that then are particularized, as in each of our family relationships